The rest stop off the highway was nearly empty, just a few cars parked beneath the harsh glow of overhead lights and the faint buzz of vending machines breaking the silence. The man had pulled over to stretch his legs and grab a bottle of water, wearing a hoodie and jeans, his phone in one hand, earbuds in the other. He moved with a casual calm, the kind of quiet assurance that comes from traveling alone. It was late, not quite midnight, and the road behind him had been long. He had no reason to think anything was unusual as he stepped out of the restroom and back toward his car. But the flash of red and blue lights in the rear-view mirror changed that. A squad car crept into the lot, moving slow and deliberate. Two officers inside watched him from a distance before one stepped out, hand resting near his holster. The man noticed but didn't react. He kept his hands visible, his movements deliberate. The officer called out, asking what he was doing there. The question wasn't casual, it was loaded. The man paused, confused. He explained that he was driving across the state, taking a break. He offered his ID without being asked, something he'd learned to do. The officer looked it over, nodded slightly, but didn't seem satisfied. His partner stepped out, saying they'd had reports of suspicious activity at rest stops in the area. No specific details, just suspicious activity. The man asked if he was being detained. The first officer said no, not yet, but they weren't letting him go either. They asked to search his vehicle. He refused calmly, politely, said they needed a warrant. The refusal changed something in the air. The partner's stance shifted. The first officer's tone hardened. One of them radioed for backup. The man stood still, hands still visible. Another cruiser arrived minutes later, then a third. Suddenly, the empty rest stop wasn't so empty. Flashlights flicked on, voices multiplied, orders were barked. Get on the ground, show your hands, don't move. He followed every command, lying face down on the pavement while the officers surrounded him, some with hands on weapons, some with zip ties ready. A woman sitting in a parked car nearby started recording. Another man stepped out of his truck and watched from a distance. Murmurs spread through the lot as more people took out their phones. The man on the ground said nothing. He didn't resist. His ID was still in the officer's hand. A few minutes passed, then a voice, one of the newer arrivals, said something crude, something racially charged, under his breath, but loud enough. It wasn't meant to be heard, but it was. The woman recording gasped audibly. Her phone caught it. The other bystanders heard it too. One of them stepped forward, asking why the man was being treated like a criminal when he had done nothing wrong. The officers didn't answer. The situation didn't cool down. If anything, the tension rose. One of the officers pulled the man to his feet roughly. His hands were zip-tied behind his back. Still, he said nothing. His eyes scanned the growing crowd. There was a look on his face, one of weary recognition, not surprise. The officers began to question him again, asking if he had drugs, if he had weapons, if he had anything in the car they should know about. He repeated that he had nothing, that they had no reason to search. One officer walked around to the back of the vehicle, shined a light inside. Another looked toward the woman with the phone and told her to back up. She didn't move. A supervisor arrived at some point, called in from a nearby precinct. The woman told him what she heard. Another man played back the recording. The supervisor listened. His face changed. Quietly, he pulled one of the officers aside. Two others followed. The crowd watched closely, silent now. The man still stood with his hands behind his back, shoulders tight, eyes fixed on the pavement. The officers were talking now, low and clipped, trying not to be heard. The supervisor looked back toward the vehicle, then toward the man, then toward the growing cluster of bystanders holding phones. No one was leaving. No one was looking away. He didn't flinch when they raised their voices, didn't argue when they crowded around, didn't resist when one of them grabbed his wrist to pull him upright. The man kept his voice low, measured, calm in the face of what had become an overwhelming presence. There were now at least 5 officers surrounding him, most of them younger, all of them white. Their body language was sharp, aggressive, informed more by assumption than evidence. He stood still, asking again if he was being arrested. The first officer didn't answer directly. He just said they were investigating a potential situation. Though what that situation was, no one could say the man's refusal to consent to a search hadn't gone over well. One of the officers had taken that personally, like it was defiance. They didn't need a reason, they said, if they had reasonable suspicion. He asked again what exactly they suspected. Their answers were vague, circular. He matched a description. He was in an area known for trafficking. His vehicle looked out of place. None of it held weight. None of it was enough. But still, they stood around him, demanding cooperation he had already given when backup arrived. It wasn't in response to danger. It was a show of force. 3 more cruisers pulled in fast, tires crunching over gravel, doors slammed, lights still flashed. The rest stop glowed like a scene from a movie, but there was no action, no cause, just posturing. The man didn't change his posture. He kept his hands at his sides, his voice even, explaining over and over that he had done nothing. They questioned why he was traveling at night. He told them he preferred to drive when the roads were quiet. They asked where he was headed. He answered. They asked what was in his car. He told them a backpack, a water bottle, a charger, a few clothes. They asked again if they could search. He declined again. That's when the tone shifted again. The original officer stepped closer, chest puffed, arms tense. He told the man he was making things difficult, that if he had nothing to hide, he wouldn't mind a search. The man replied that his rights didn't depend on whether he had something to hide. That was when another officer, a younger one with a buzz cut, stepped in, voice raised, telling the man to turn around. When he didn't move fast enough, 2 of them grabbed his arms and twisted them behind his back. He winced but didn't resist. He asked why he was being detained. One of the officers said, "For our safety." There was no threat, but the phrase was delivered like a script people were watching by now. One woman, maybe in her early 30s, had been leaning against her car with her arms crossed, phone in hand, recording. Another man, older, was sitting on the curb watching everything unfold. The cops weren't subtle. They raised their voices louder as if to assert dominance. One officer moved toward the car and peered into the windows with a flashlight. The man turned his head slightly, asked if they had a warrant. No one answered. The zip ties came out, tight, quick. The man's shoulders tensed, but he didn't pull away. They told him to sit on the curb. He sat. He didn't speak anymore. The backup officers didn't seem to understand why they were even there. A few of them looked confused, like they'd been expecting something else. An armed suspect, maybe, a volatile scene. What they saw was a man in a hoodie sitting quietly in the dark, while 5 officers circled his car like vultures. The tension wasn't coming from the man, it was coming from them. The situation felt heavy not because of danger, but because of how far it had gone with nothing to justify it. They kept asking questions, repeating the same ones. His license, his registration, where he worked, why he was traveling alone, what time he'd left, what route he'd taken. Every answer was clear, calm, exact. He had nothing to hide, but he wasn't going to let them act like he didn't matter. He kept reminding them, without yelling, without threats, that they still hadn't told him why he was being held. The longer it went on, the more it became obvious that there was no real answer, just the fact that he was there. Alone at night, in a place they didn't expect to see someone like him. That was all it took. The first voices that spoke up didn't shout. They asked questions, firm but calm, as the officers surrounded the man and placed him in zip ties. One woman, still recording, said she'd been there the whole time and hadn't seen him do anything. A teenager nearby asked why they needed so many cops for someone who hadn't even raised his voice. Another man, leaning against a pickup truck, said the whole thing looked like harassment. The officers didn't respond. They kept their focus on the man, still seated on the curb, still silent. His head was down, eyes forward, hands behind his back. He didn't speak, didn't move. The woman holding her phone walked a little closer, still filming. She narrated what she'd seen, loud enough for others to hear. Said the man had just walked out of the restroom. said he hadn't argued, hadn't resisted. She pointed out that he'd handed over his ID before anyone even asked. One officer looked over and told her to back up, said it was an active investigation. She asked what the investigation was about. He didn't answer. Instead, he told her again to move back. She took a small step but kept her phone up, zoomed in a little closer. Another bystander, a man in his 40s with a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, pulled out his own phone. He started recording from a different angle, standing by a vending machine across the lot. He said he was calling someone, maybe a lawyer, maybe local media. The cops shifted slightly, aware now that the situation had drawn more eyes. One officer, clearly agitated, muttered something under his breath and paced back toward his cruiser. The crowd wasn't large, but it was growing. 2 more cars had pulled in, and a young couple watched quietly through their windshield. Tension hung in the air like humidity before a storm. The silence from the man at the center of it all added weight. He didn't plead, he didn't try to explain again. He just sat there, letting the officers talk over each other, their voices growing sharper as they tried to assert control in a situation that no longer seemed under their control. Someone asked again, more loudly this time, why is he in cuffs if he didn't do anything? One of the original officers snapped back, said it was for officer safety, but the answer didn't satisfy anyone. The woman with the phone responded that officer safety doesn't justify violating rights. Another man agreed. One of the officers, nervous or frustrated or both, called in again on his radio, asking for direction. He glanced at the growing crowd and seemed to realize things were changing. Public pressure was mounting with every new video being taken, every question being asked. The other officers tried to maintain authority, but their confidence was cracking. One shifted uncomfortably and avoided eye contact. Another kept glancing toward the parked phones. The crowd wasn't hostile, but it wasn't passive either. These were not people looking away. They were staying, watching, recording, remembering. Even as the situation became more tense, the man remained still. He seemed to understand the power of his silence. His refusal to react gave the crowd more reason to speak for him. A woman asked if anyone had live-streamed the encounter. A young man near the edge of the lot said he was broadcasting to social media. He called out the name of the platform. Someone else asked if the officers had body cams on. That question wasn't answered. It was ignored entirely. The officers kept trying to move the focus back to the man, but their words were being drowned out by the presence of witnesses. A few minutes later, another car arrived. This one different, no lights on top, no markings. Someone stepped out, not in uniform, wearing a badge on a chain around his neck. He didn't say much at first, just looked around, taking in the scene, the zip-tied man, the silent circle of officers, and the crowd of citizens with phones raised like shields. The man on the curb finally looked up. Their eyes met briefly, but no words were exchanged. The bystanders didn't move, the cameras didn't lower, the questions kept coming. The officers, once so loud and certain, were quieter now. Less sure, less in control. It happened fast, but not fast enough to go unnoticed. One of the officers, the one who had seemed most agitated since arriving, leaned toward another and muttered something sharp. The words weren't meant for anyone else, but they carried. The woman filming turned her head, eyes narrowing. "What did you just say?" she asked. The officer didn't answer. He turned away like he hadn't said anything. But others had heard it too. A man standing by the trash bin repeated the phrase under his breath in disbelief. The woman brought her phone closer and said loud enough for the camera, "He just said, another one of these animals, always acting like victims." The silence that followed was heavier than anything else that night. The man on the curb didn't look up. His face didn't change, but the atmosphere around him shifted completely. The crowd reacted, not with shouts, not yet, but with a charged kind of quiet that felt louder than any yelling. That word "animals" hung in the air like smoke. Everyone there knew what it meant, what it was meant to imply, how it had been used before to strip people of dignity, to justify abuse. The officer who said it glanced around, realizing slowly that he'd been heard, maybe recorded. His jaw clenched. He didn't repeat it, but he didn't take it back either. Another officer nearby looked visibly uncomfortable, like the line had been crossed and he didn't want to be part of it. He avoided eye contact with the crowd, with his fellow officers, with the man in zip ties. One of the bystanders shouted now, voice raised, "Say it again, say it to the camera." The officer didn't respond. He turned away and walked toward his cruiser. The woman filming repeated what she'd heard, documenting it clearly. This officer just called him an animal. That's what this is about. Not safety, not procedure racism, plain and simple. The mood changed quickly after that. The people watching weren't just witnesses anymore. They were participants. They spoke louder, stepped closer. A man in a truck honked twice, then got out and walked toward the group, holding up his own phone. He said he was calling the media. Another woman said she was calling a civil rights attorney. The officers now had more attention than they could control. One officer tried to restore calm, raising his hands and telling people to step back, but his voice didn't carry the same authority anymore. The comment had cut through every excuse they tried to lean on. The man still hadn't spoken. He didn't need to. The crowd spoke for him now. Someone asked loudly whether the officers had probable cause. Someone else asked why the man hadn't been read his rights. Another person shouted that this was going to go viral. The officers didn't answer any of it. They stood still, stiff, waiting for instruction that wasn't coming. The one who'd made the remark had stopped speaking altogether. He leaned on the side of his cruiser, arms crossed, trying to seem unfazed, but his eyes kept darting to the phones, to the people surrounding him. He knew he'd made a mistake. He just didn't think it would matter. Now he wasn't so sure. The man on the curb finally looked up. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes said more than enough. He looked directly at the officer who had spoken. He held the stare. The officer looked away. The woman recording stepped closer, asking again if any of the officers were going to address what was said. Another officer, not the one who made the remark, started to respond but stopped short. There was no excuse to offer, no spin that could make it disappear. They all knew it. The silence stretched out, broken only by the hum of the highway and the recording notifications from multiple phones. There was no attempt to deny it, no apology, no correction. The word had been said. It was heard, it was recorded, and now it was going to follow them. The crowd didn't let up. They asked for badge numbers. They asked for names. They demanded to know which precinct the officers came from. No one answered. The power dynamic had shifted. The officers still had their weapons, their radios, their uniforms, but they no longer had the benefit of the doubt. That had been stripped away by a single word, spoken without thought, but with every ounce of ugly meaning behind it. The quiet was different when the unmarked car pulled in. No sirens, no lights, just the low hum of tires over pavement and a door closing with calm precision. The man who stepped out was older, in plain clothes, with a badge clipped to his belt and a folder tucked under one arm. He didn't rush. He didn't bark orders. He just walked straight toward the cluster of officers, eyes scanning the scene. His presence immediately changed the posture of the group. Some officers straightened. Others shifted awkwardly. The man on the curb didn't move. The bystanders didn't stop recording. The plainclothes officer didn't need to ask what happened. He could see it. A black man sitting zip-tied on the pavement. A group of officers standing around looking cornered. A crowd of civilians with their phones pointed like flashlights exposing a crime. He walked past the cruisers without looking at them, stepped around the perimeter of the group, and stopped in front of the man. They exchanged a glance. The man blinked once, said nothing. The officer didn't speak to him yet. He turned instead to the nearest uniformed cop and asked what was going on. The officer hesitated, stumbled through an explanation, words like suspicion, potential threat, refused search. The plainclothes officer nodded slowly, but his eyes didn't leave the man's face. He asked for ID. The original officer handed it over. He examined it, checked the name, looked at the man again. Then he turned to the crowd. Did anyone record what happened? Several people said yes at once. One woman stepped forward, phone still recording, and said she had video from the beginning. The plainclothes officer asked to see it. She held it out. He didn't touch the phone, just leaned in and watched a few seconds. Then he straightened and looked back at the group of officers. The question came flatly. Did anyone search the car? One officer said no, because he refused consent. The plainclothes man nodded again. Was he under arrest? Another pause. The answer was no, not officially. Then why was he in zip ties? That part didn't get an immediate answer. The silence dragged out. One officer started to speak, but the plainclothes man raised a hand. Don't, just stop talking. He turned back to the man and crouched slightly to meet his eyes. Are you hurt? The man shook his head once. They touch your car? Another shake of the head. You tell them they couldn't search. The man nodded. You give them ID. Nod. Did they say you were under arrest? The man didn't respond at first. Then they said I wasn't. Then they did this. He held up his tied wrists. The plainclothes officer stood. He walked back over to the group. His tone was flat, professional, but final. Cut him loose. No one moved. Now, one of the officers fumbled for a knife and stepped forward, slicing the zip ties. The man flexed his hands, slow and careful. He didn't stand yet. The officer who had made the racial comment stood back, arms still crossed, eyes low. The plainclothes officer looked directly at him. We'll be speaking separately. Then he turned to the others. Who else was here from the start? Hands raised. Who heard what was said? More hands. The crowd confirmed it. Phones were held up again. Someone repeated the words. The plainclothes officer didn't ask for playback. He didn't need to. His face said enough. He turned to the woman who had recorded the slur and asked for her name and contact. She gave it without hesitation. A man nearby handed over his card, said he was a witness. The officer nodded, took the info, and asked if anyone else had video. Several people stepped forward. He gave them a number to send it to. Don't delete anything, he said. This is a formal review now. He looked again at the officers who had remained silent through it all. You'll be contacted individually, he said. Go back to your cruisers. Do not speak to each other about what happened tonight. Do not delete any body cam footage. Do not leave town. Internal Affairs will reach out within the hour. They didn't argue. They dispersed slowly without speaking. No one looked at the man who had been detained. No one apologized. The plainclothes officer watched them go, then turned back to the man on the curb. The man still hadn't stood. He was just watching quietly, letting the moment unfold around him. The crowd stayed where they were, phones still raised, waiting for what came next.